Have you ever stopped to think that sometimes the truest loyalty doesn't come from those who flatter us or share our social circles, but from the quietest people the world chooses to ignore? This is the story of Richard Coleman, a billionaire who believed money alone could guarantee respect and obedience. What he was about to discover about his maid, Grace Miller, would forever change the way he looked at his life. Stay with me until the end, because what happens in this story is going to move you. And before we begin, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe so you won't miss any of our emotional stories. Richard Coleman was a man of power, a well-known figure on the covers of financial magazines. Praised as a visionary and ruthless deal-maker, he built an empire in New York's corporate world. His mansion in the wealthy suburbs of Westchester was his fortress. Tall stone walls, imported cars lined up in the driveway, crystal chandeliers glowing in vast marble halls. To outsiders, he was the portrait of success. But behind that image of dominance lived a lonely man. Every evening he dined at a 10-seat mahogany table by himself, the echo of cutlery bouncing off the walls his only company. He spent countless hours locked in his office, flipping through contracts that no longer satisfied him, sipping wine that tasted empty. His younger sister, Diane, visited only to argue about inheritance or assets. Friends? There were none. Only partners, rivals, and those who sought to benefit from his influence. Richard had convinced himself he didn't need anyone. In his philosophy, emotions were weaknesses. Respect could be purchased with generous salaries. Loyalty could be commanded through fear or power. Anyone who didn't accept that rule was cast out of his circle. The staff in the mansion knew this well. They kept their eyes down, speaking only when spoken to, executing his orders without hesitation. A scolding was more common than a thank you. To them, Richard was untouchable, cold, nearly inhuman. Yet, among those many overlooked faces, there was one woman who saw more than just a wealthy tyrant. Grace Miller, the quietest of his employees, had been working in the mansion for almost a decade. She didn't gossip, never raised her voice, and moved about her duties with calm precision. To others, she was practically invisible. But Grace had an eye for details, small cracks in the armor Richard wore so proudly. She noticed how he returned home late at night, shoulders slumped, sometimes not even touching the expensive meals laid out for him. She saw him fall asleep on the leather sofa in his office, contracts scattered around, an unfinished glass of wine left by his side. She watched him move through the house like a ghost, carrying an invisible burden that none of his wealth could ease. While other staff whispered about his arrogance, Grace kept silent. She didn't ignore his flaws. She simply saw the loneliness hidden behind them. She didn't pity him either. She just understood that beneath his polished image was a man who lacked something essential: care. So she created small, unspoken habits. She placed a bottle of water by his bedside table every night. She neatly folded the jackets he left draped across furniture. She extinguished the lights he forgot to switch off, closed the windows he left open so the night air wouldn't chill him. She never expected gratitude, nor did she mention it aloud. She did it because she believed someone had to. To Grace, caring was part of her essence, and she intended to keep doing it quietly, whether Richard ever noticed or not. But one night, fate decided he would. It was well past midnight when Richard stirred awake. The house was silent, save for the faint hum of the security system. He was lying in bed, restless when he heard the subtle creak of his bedroom door. Keeping his eyes nearly shut, he pretended to sleep, but watched closely. To his astonishment, Grace stepped in softly, carrying a folded blanket. Her movements were delicate, almost reverent. She approached his bed, draped the blanket gently across his shoulders, and adjusted it so he would not wake cold. Then she leaned slightly closer, as if making sure his breathing was calm, and whispered to herself, "You need rest more than you admit, Mr. Coleman." With that, she left, closing the door as quietly as she had opened it. Richard lay frozen, his pulse quickening. In all his life, nobody had ever done something so simple yet so profoundly human for him, without expecting something in return. He was used to expensive gifts, strategic favors, and endless flattery, all of it motivated by personal gain. But this was different. It was genuine. A storm of emotions ran through him. His pride was bruised by the thought of being vulnerable in front of a maid. Anger bubbled too. How dare she act without permission? And yet beneath it all, he felt something unfamiliar, a warmth, a fragile sense of comfort that he hadn't experienced in decades. He turned over in bed, but sleep never came. The image of Grace covering him stayed with him until dawn. For the first time, Richard Coleman wondered if he wasn't as invincible as he believed. And worse, he realized maybe he didn't want to be. And you? What would you do if you discovered someone had been quietly taking care of you in ways you never noticed? Would you accept it with gratitude or push it away out of fear of feeling exposed? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget, if you want to keep following stories that reveal the hidden power of loyalty and compassion, hit the like button now and subscribe to the channel. Because what Richard is about to discover next will surprise you even more. The next morning, Richard woke earlier than usual. He sat in front of the mirror in his marble bathroom, staring at his reflection. The custom-tailored robe, the silver watch, the sharp lines of his face, they all projected strength. Yet what lingered behind his eyes wasn't confidence. It was the unsettling memory of Grace's whisper and the soft weight of a blanket pulled over his shoulders. He muttered to himself, "I don't need anyone. I've built everything on my own." But even as the words left his lips, he knew they weren't entirely true. His empire had been constructed on contracts, lawyers, and employees who bowed their heads. But real connection? That was something he had never managed to buy. At breakfast, the mansion was as silent as always. The staff moved efficiently around him, pouring coffee, serving eggs, setting plates. Grace stood at the far end, calm as ever, avoiding his gaze. She didn't act as though anything unusual had happened the night before. To her, perhaps, it was nothing more than a routine kindness. To him, it was a breach in the armor he had carefully forged. Throughout the day, Richard's irritation grew. In his office downtown, he slammed files onto the table, snapped at assistants, and cut short meetings with executives. His outbursts weren't really about them, they were about himself. He felt cornered by an emotion he despised: gratitude. By evening, as he poured himself another glass of Bordeaux in the quiet of his office, his mind returned to Grace. He hated that he kept thinking about her. Not in the way a man might think of a woman, but in the way someone begins to notice an uncomfortable truth. She saw his weakness. She had touched a nerve, and Richard Coleman was a man who didn't tolerate being vulnerable. The following night, as he prepared for bed, he found himself glancing repeatedly at the door. Part of him expected Grace to appear again. Another part dreaded it. He tossed and turned, restless with anticipation and fear, but the door never opened. The hours passed in silence. By dawn, he realized he felt strangely disappointed. Days rolled by, and Richard's restlessness only deepened. He began to watch Grace from a distance, trying to decode her motives. She went about her work with quiet efficiency, polishing silver, arranging flowers, tidying rooms. Nothing in her manner suggested ambition or manipulation, but Richard refused to believe anyone acted out of pure kindness. What's her angle? He wondered. Finally, one evening, unable to contain himself, he confronted her. She was arranging the dining table when he entered abruptly, his voice sharper than intended. "Why do you do more than I ask, Grace? You fix my jackets, you tidy my office, you—" He paused, searching for words. "You go beyond what your job requires." "Why?" Grace looked up at him, her expression steady, almost serene. She answered simply, "Because it's right, sir. That's all." The reply disarmed him. There was no calculation in her voice, no hidden demand, just truth. For a moment, Richard was left speechless. He turned away quickly, muttering something about being careful not to cross boundaries, but inside he felt shaken. That night, sitting alone with a fire crackling in the vast living room, her words echoed in his mind. Because it's right. Richard had lived his entire life measuring worth in terms of winning and losing. What profit does this bring? What power does that decision secure? But here was someone who operated under a completely different code. A maid, with nothing of material wealth, yet richer in principles than he had ever been. In the days that followed, subtle changes began to creep into Richard's behavior. He found himself hesitating before barking orders. Once he even managed to mutter a strained "thank you" when Grace placed his morning coffee beside him. It felt foreign on his tongue, but not unwelcome. The other staff noticed. Whispers passed through the hallways. "He's different lately." Some dismissed it as temporary, others raised eyebrows in disbelief. But Grace said nothing. She continued her quiet work, her expression unchanged, though inside she felt the shift. She had seen men in power before, and most never altered their ways. Was Richard truly different? Or was it just a fleeting crack in his armor? One evening, Richard came home from a long day of negotiations. The deal had gone his way. He had won again, but the victory tasted hollow. Instead of celebrating, he wandered into the kitchen where he found Grace humming softly while rinsing vegetables. He froze in the doorway, watching her. She didn't notice him at first. She was singing a tune he didn't recognize, a melody simple and soothing. Something about the scene, the ordinary act of preparing food, the gentleness of her voice, brought Richard more peace than any award, any gala, any headline he had ever received. When she finally turned and saw him, she startled slightly. "Good evening, Mr. Coleman," she said politely. Richard's throat tightened. He wanted to say something more, something real, but pride clamped his words. All he managed was a curt nod before retreating upstairs, where he sat on the edge of his bed, shaken by how profoundly that moment had affected him. Over the next week, his struggle grew heavier. He wanted to acknowledge her. He wanted to admit that her quiet presence had softened the sharp edges of his life, but to do so meant lowering the mask he had worn for decades. It meant admitting weakness. And Richard Coleman had built an empire on the belief that weakness was unforgivable. One Sunday morning, the turning point arrived. The staff gathered in the grand hall for instructions about an upcoming charity gala Richard was hosting. He stood before them, his usual commanding posture in place. But as his eyes scanned the room, they landed on Grace. For the first time, he saw her not as part of the background, but as the one person who had truly cared for him. He hesitated. Then, against every instinct, he spoke differently. "For years," he began, his voice uncharacteristically soft, "I believed respect was something you could purchase, that people stayed by your side only for what you gave them. But I was wrong." A hush fell over the staff. They had never heard their employer speak this way. Richard turned directly to Grace. "This woman has been invisible to me for far too long. Yet she has done more for me than anyone else in this house. She cared when no one else did. She made this mansion feel less like a museum and more like a home." Grace's face flushed red. She bowed her head, embarrassed, but her eyes glistened. Around them, murmurs of surprise filled the hall. Some of the staff clapped quietly, unsure if they were allowed, while others looked stunned. Richard cleared his throat, regaining some of his sternness. "From this day forward, I want her treated with the respect she deserves. She's not just another employee. She is essential to this house." When the meeting ended, Grace slipped away quickly, overwhelmed. But alone in his office later, Richard leaned back in his chair, staring out the window at the city skyline. For the first time, he felt lighter. Speaking the truth aloud had cost him his pride, but it had also freed him. Yet even as relief settled in, fear whispered at the edges of his mind. What if he couldn't change completely? What if he slid back into old habits? He had taken the first step, but the road ahead would test him more than any business deal ever had. And you, if you were in Richard's place, Would you be brave enough to admit your mistakes publicly, or would you cling to pride until the very end? Share your thoughts in the comments, because what comes next in Richard's story will reveal just how far loyalty and compassion can reach. Richard thought that after acknowledging Grace publicly, the unease inside him would finally fade. But the truth was the opposite. The applause from the staff still echoed in his mind, not because he felt proud, but because it had exposed him. For the first time in his career as a ruthless businessman, he had shown vulnerability. He couldn't stop replaying that moment, wondering if he had gone too far. The following days were filled with contradictions. In his office, he barked orders as usual, trying to prove to himself that nothing had changed. But every time Grace appeared quietly in the background, his words softened, his tone shifted. He caught himself thanking her again. Once, when she brought him a stack of forgotten documents, another time when she set down his evening tea. Each time, the word felt both foreign and liberating. At night, lying in his bed, Richard battled against a gnawing realization he was beginning to rely on her. Not in the way one relies on a business partner or a lawyer, but in the way a lonely man begins to cling to the only genuine presence in his life. That thought terrified him. It made him feel exposed, unguarded. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of negotiations, he returned to the mansion to find Grace in the library. She was dusting the shelves, humming a tune softly to herself. Richard stood in the doorway for a long time, unnoticed. The melody was simple, but it stirred something in him. When she finally saw him, she paused, lowering her eyes respectfully. "Good evening, Mr. Coleman," she said. He almost answered with his usual curt nod, but instead, the words slipped out. "What song is that?" Grace looked at him in surprise, then smiled faintly. "It's an old lullaby my mother used to sing. Nothing special." Richard hesitated, then admitted, "It sounds peaceful." Their eyes met briefly before he turned away, embarrassed by the intimacy of the moment. But as he walked back to his office, he realized that, for the first time in years, he had allowed himself to admit that something small, something human, had touched him. The next morning, Richard decided to test himself. He invited the staff to have breakfast with him, something unheard of in the Coleman household. The employees were hesitant, exchanging nervous glances as they sat at the long dining table. Richard, at the head, felt strangely awkward, like a stranger in his own home. Grace served the food, as always, but he gestured for her to sit down too. She froze. "Sir, I don't think—" "Sit," he interrupted, though his tone was gentler than usual. She obeyed, placing herself at the very end of the table. The breakfast was quiet at first, but soon the cook made a joke, the gardener added a story, and laughter filled the air. Richard sat back, astonished. He hadn't heard such a sound in his house in years. The echo of joy bouncing off the marble walls made the mansion feel alive again. But as much as Richard wanted to embrace this change, old habits fought back. That afternoon in a board meeting, one of his executives challenged his decision. Richard's temper flared, and he unleashed a tirade that left the room in silence. On the drive home, he sat in the back of his car, ashamed. He wondered if his transformation was just an illusion, something temporary, fragile. That night, as he walked past the garden, he found Grace kneeling by the flower beds, pulling weeds under the glow of the lanterns. He stopped and watched her again. She looked up, sensing his presence. "You shouldn't be doing that this late," he said. "I don't mind," she answered softly. "Some things need care when no one else is looking." Her words pierced him. Richard realized she wasn't just talking about flowers. She was talking about him. Over the following weeks, Richard grew increasingly restless. He began asking himself questions he had never dared before. What was the point of building an empire if it left him alone at the top? What good was power if no one truly respected the man behind it? One rainy evening, he called Grace to his office. She entered quietly, her hands folded. Richard stared at her for a long moment before speaking. "Grace, do you ever wonder why you stay here?" Why you work for someone like me?" She blinked, surprised by the question. "I stay because I believe even the hardest hearts can change. And because—" she hesitated, "because I don't see just the man everyone else sees." Richard leaned back, his chest tight. "And what do you see?" "I see someone who's been carrying too much for too long. Someone who thinks he's alone, but doesn't have to be." Her honesty left him silent. He dismissed her gently, but once she was gone, he buried his face in his hands. For decades he had built walls around himself, higher and higher. And yet, a single woman with no power, no wealth, no reason to care, had managed to see through the cracks. The climax came during the charity gala he hosted the following month. The mansion was filled with the city's elite, chandeliers glowing above tables draped in white. Richard mingled, smiling his practiced smile, shaking hands, giving speeches. But throughout the night, his eyes kept drifting to the back of the room, where Grace stood among the staff, unnoticed by the glittering crowd. At one point, he overheard two guests whispering cruelly about her appearance, mocking her plain dress and quiet demeanor. Something inside him snapped. He strode to the microphone and silenced the room with a wave of his hand. "Tonight," he began, "we celebrate charity and community, but let me tell you what real charity looks like. It looks like loyalty. It looks like kindness with no reward. It looks like someone who works in silence, never asking for recognition, yet giving more than anyone else in this room." Gasps spread through the crowd. The elite looked around, confused, until Richard turned toward the back of the hall. "It looks like Grace," he said firmly. Every eye followed his gaze. Grace froze, her face pale. The room filled with whispers, some scandalized, others curious. Richard continued, "If you want to know what real wealth is, don't look at me. Look at her. Because she has given me something no amount of money could ever buy: humanity." The hall erupted in mixed reactions. Some clapped, others whispered behind their hands. Grace stood still, overwhelmed, tears brimming in her eyes. For Richard, it was a defining moment. He had thrown away the mask. He no longer cared about the judgment of his peers. That night, after the guests left, he found Grace in the garden. She was still shaken, unsure of how to process the public declaration. "Why did you do that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Because it's the truth," Richard answered simply. "And I'm tired of hiding behind lies." For a long moment, neither spoke. The rain had stopped, leaving the air cool and fresh. Richard looked at her with a vulnerability he had never shown anyone. "You've changed me, Grace, and I don't know if I can ever repay you." Grace shook her head gently. "I never asked for repayment. I only wanted you to see what was already there." Adieu. And in that quiet garden, Richard Coleman realized that the empire he had built was nothing compared to the home he had finally begun to create. Not with money, but with humility. And you, if you were in Richard's place, would you have the courage to tear down your pride in front of everyone? Or would you keep hiding behind the mask of wealth? Share your thoughts below, because the final chapter of this story will reveal whether Richard can truly hold on to this transformation, or whether the weight of his old self will pull him back. The days that followed the gala were unlike anything Richard Coleman had ever experienced. For years, his name had been tied to headlines about mergers, power struggles, and luxury. But now, newspapers and whispers across the city were buzzing about something different, a single speech in which he publicly praised Grace Miller, his longtime housekeeper. For some, it was a sign of weakness, proof that the once impenetrable magnate had softened. For others, it was a revelation, a rare glimpse of humanity from a man they thought incapable of humility. Richard read the papers in silence, the weight of the world's opinions pressing against him, as it always had. But for the first time, he didn't care. The judgment of socialites and shareholders no longer mattered. What mattered was the quiet change inside him, the shift Grace had stirred without ever demanding anything in return. At the mansion, the atmosphere had changed in subtle but undeniable ways. The staff, who once moved like ghosts through the corridors, now spoke to one another more openly. Laughter, once rare, drifted faintly through the halls. It wasn't just Richard's speech that had altered the household. It was the acknowledgement that someone among them, someone invisible for so long, had finally been seen. And Grace, though humbled by the attention, carried on with the same quiet dignity, never asking for more than her role. Richard, however, could not look at her the same way. Each time he saw her setting a vase of flowers on the table or folding linens in the laundry room, he felt something stir in his chest, a mix of guilt and gratitude, admiration and unease. For years he had built walls so thick he thought no one could see through them, yet Grace had pierced them not with confrontation, but with kindness so simple it had become undeniable. One evening, restless and unable to sleep, Richard wandered into the kitchen. The lights were dim, and the scent of freshly baked bread lingered in the air. Grace was there, finishing the last of her duties for the night. She looked up, startled to see him standing in the doorway. "You should be resting, Mr. Coleman," she said softly, wiping her hands on a towel. For a moment, Richard couldn't speak. He simply watched her, realizing how different this felt compared to his endless business encounters. Here was someone who owed him nothing beyond her job, and yet she had given him more honesty and loyalty than anyone in his circle of power. "Grace," he finally said, his voice low, "do you ever wonder why you keep doing what you do here? Why you care?" She tilted her head, studying him with eyes that seemed to see far deeper than he wanted. "Because it matters," she replied. "Because people matter, even when they don't see it themselves." The words settled heavy in the air. Richard swallowed hard, feeling the sting of a truth he had spent his life avoiding. "I don't deserve it," he murmured. Grace offered a faint smile. "Maybe not, but sometimes we don't give because someone deserves it. We give because it's the right thing to do." That night, long after she had gone upstairs, Richard remained in the kitchen, staring at the empty chair where she had sat. He realized that for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. The silence of the mansion no longer mocked him. It invited him to think, to feel, to imagine what it would be like to live differently. Weeks passed and small changes began to surface in Richard's behavior. He no longer barked orders at the staff. Instead, he spoke with them, sometimes even sharing a meal. He spent less time at the office and more time walking the gardens or sitting in the library, lost in thought. The man who once measured life by profits and prestige was slowly learning to measure it by connection. But the greatest change happened quietly, without ceremony. One morning, Richard entered the dining room and found Grace already setting the table. For years, this had been routine. Yet this time, instead of sitting at the far end of the long marble table, he pulled out a chair closer to her, breaking the distance that had always defined their relationship. She glanced at him, puzzled. "Is something wrong, sir?" "No," he said, his tone softer than she'd ever heard. "I just thought maybe we could share breakfast." The pause that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken memories of cold meals eaten in silence. Slowly, Grace nodded, and for the first time in a decade, Richard Coleman shared a simple meal with another person, not as master and servant, but as two human beings. From that day on, something shifted permanently. The mansion began to feel less like a museum and more like a home. The staff, encouraged by Richard's subtle warmth, relaxed in their roles. And Grace, though never one to seek the spotlight, found herself at the heart of a transformation she had never asked for but had quietly nurtured. One evening, Richard gathered everyone in the main hall, the staff who had served him faithfully, some for years. Standing at the base of the grand staircase, he cleared his throat. His voice, though steady, carried an unfamiliar tremor. "For a long time, I believed power and wealth were the only measures of respect. I thought loyalty was bought, not given freely. I was wrong." His gaze found Grace in the crowd. "It took someone who asked for nothing, who worked without recognition to show me the truth." Grace Miller. You reminded me what it means to be human. For that, I owe you more than I can ever repay." The room fell into silence, broken only by the soft applause of the staff. Grace lowered her head, overwhelmed, but when she looked up again, her eyes met Richard's with quiet strength. Later that night, Richard stood alone on the balcony of his bedroom, staring at the city skyline. For years, that view had symbolized conquest, each building a testament to his power. But tonight, it looked different. He realized the empire he had built meant nothing if it left him hollow inside. What mattered was not the wealth he had amassed, but the humanity he had almost forgotten. As the wind swept across the balcony, Richard whispered to himself words he never thought he would say. "Thank you, Grace." Inside, Grace was finishing her nightly rounds, unaware of the storm of gratitude and humility raging in the heart of the man she had quietly cared for. She didn't need to hear it. For her, doing what was right had always been enough. And yet, Richard knew. He knew that his life had been irrevocably changed, not by a merger or a deal, but by the silent loyalty of a woman the world barely noticed. So ask yourself this: how many people in your own life quietly care for you without asking for anything in return? Don't wait until it's too late to see them. If this story moved you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the greatest wealth is found not in money, but in humanity.